right, Linda asks, what does the Bible say about tithing?
Well, I can tell you what the Old Testament says. There is a New Testament understanding of giving, and it's in 2 Corinthians 9. And when I say New Testament, I'm not saying that we dismiss everything in the Old Testament, because I think that's foolish. I think it's there are some Christians who kind of treat the Old Testament like it's almost like I don't know. It's like they're embarrassed by it. Like, this is the God of the Old Testament. He's not like that anymore.
Right.
We don't want you to know about him. But there's like some principles that God gave the nation of Israel, and tithing was one of them. And the tithe just means a tenth. And so in the Old Testament, in the nation of Israel, if you're part of the kingdom, you were supposed to tithe. Like, and actually a tenth was the baseline for giving in the ancient Israel. And so you gave a tenth of everything. Now, we don't, back then it wasn't money necessarily. It was usually like crops and animals and stuff. That's what you gave. So if you had 10 sheep, you would give one, and that would go to God. And then that would again be your baseline. Then you'd have all these offerings that you have on top of it. When you sinned, you would give something to God. When you want to make a sacrifice, all these things that you go before God with. And it ended up being a lot more than 10%. But Paul, basically, to combat some of the Judaizers in the New Testament, he kind of, he doesn't say that we don't tithe anymore. You never get that mentality. You don't get the idea that as a Jew, circumcision wasn't important. But what he does do is he makes the distinction now that as believers, we're no longer bound by the law. The law was a tutor to bring us to Christ. And there are things in the law that continue to show us how much we need God. And I think giving is one of those things that, we need to see. I think it was... Oh gosh, Martin Luther, or it might have been Martin Luther or Wesley, but one of the guys that says, a man experiences salvation twice: first the salvation of his heart, and then the salvation of his wallet. And it's because, like, a lot of times our attitude towards money is like the last thing that God changes. Like, we're like holding on to it. We're greedy and we want it. And so what Paul does is he just changes it to an attitude of the heart. And so no longer is it a percentage. God's not saying you have to give 10%. What he does say is in 2 Corinthians 9, he says, let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. And so when I think of New Testament giving, it needs to be something where I give of my heart. And so it needs to be something that I, in a sense, that I don't want to be someone who's giving to anything and be like reluctant about it and be like, oh, I really like this. I really like my money, and so I don't want to give it to God. And, Paul just says the thing that God really loves is he loves a cheerful giver, someone who can give, and I think the Greek word is hilarion. It's like hilariously. Like, you can give and give in such a way to where you're joyful about it, which is not an easy thing to do, and especially in modern, money-grubbing day American culture. Like, we're very selfish. We're very, we think we're poor when we're the richest, culture in the history of the world.
Yep.
And we're even the poorest of us are super greedy. And what God is doing is he wants to change our heart towards money. And I think one of the ways you do it is by giving it. It's like going, okay, God, this is not as important as I think it is. And understanding that, if you can't give of, basic necessities and trust God, I think that's a lot of it too. God is teaching us to trust in him and to be able to pick between, tithing to him and paying an electrical bill or something. God needs to be able to show himself to provide, and he's always done that in my life. My wife and I, when we were first married, we weren't super rich. We're not rich now, but like, we were pretty poor. And there were times when I was like, I didn't know how this is going to get paid, and God just always provided. And since then I don't even question. I know he's going to provide, and so the first check that I write every month is going to be my tithe check. I'm going to give, before taxes, I'm going to write to God, because that's the most important thing, and I want to do it with a good heart. And again, that's the baseline. And so my wife and I, we like to, and I'm not saying this to brag, but to encourage others that there's so many opportunities to give and to do it in cool ways. Whether it's through compassion, or we have an awesome mission at our church with Uganda, and we sponsor children, and we provide for food for them and different ministries, and be able to give to these things, and it's fantastic. I love it. It's just one of the greatest blessings that I have as a believers, and especially because we are so wealthy. And again, I'm not speaking as a pastor, but as a culture.
Sure.
We're so wealthy. We have way more than we know, than we even understand. And giving just a little bit is, is the thing, can make a huge impact in other parts of the world. Even thinking about, again, with God, it's not as much the amount as it is the percentage. And you see that explained in the parable of the widow's mite, the guy who gives of all these things. And then you have a woman who gives just a few cents, basically. And Jesus is like, who gave more? And obviously the woman who gave out of her her need, who gave out of her poverty, is the one who gave more versus someone who gives out of their plenty. So
Yeah. Awesome.